Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Gibbs Flash Forum on digital disruption. My name is Ronak Gopaldas. I am a director at Signal Risk and a fellow here at Gibbs. And today we're going to be discussing the theme of digital disruption in a COVID-19 world. We're going to look at trends, connected leadership, fake news, and cybersecurity, amongst other themes. I think what's been quite clear as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic has been this very seismic event that has been disrupted our old way of life. It's been a fundamental reset and rewiring of the political, economic, governance, and business architectures which we've all grown used to. It's generating a lot of anxiety, but also a lot of excitement, and it provides us with a real opportunity to reset the way we do things in the modern world. It's quite interesting that we're hearing a number of terms to describe this area, from coronials to quarantines to my personal favorite, baby Zoomers, which is quite apt given this platform. But what we've seen is that both individuals and businesses are scrambling and adjusting to this new way of life and trying to stay relevant. This digitization theme is not going to go away. In fact, it's probably only going to be accelerated by what we're seeing at the moment through social distancing and the likes. So what we're going to try to do today is navigate this space. A lot of us are overwhelmed by the flow of information, not quite sure how to pivot our businesses, and feeling a real sense of anxiety. And I want to chat today to a couple of experts in the field of reputational crisis management and digital risk. And those are Marina Bidoli from the Brunswick Group and Jonathan Cole, also from the Brunswick Group. And we're going to really structure this conversation in three parts. So number one, we're going to understand the current landscape. Two, unpack some of the challenges and problems that we're currently seeing as a result of this disruption. And three, shift the conversation to more of a solutions mindset. So, what I'd like to do, because we've got a lot of content to get through, is ask both Marina and Jonathan to briefly introduce themselves, and then we can get straight into the conversation.
Thanks, Ronak. So it's Marina Bidoli, Brunswick, Johannesburg office head and partner for the group. My background started out as a journalist at the Financial Mail many years ago, doing tech mainly and business journalist. And then from there, I did an MBA at Gibbs, of course, and moved on to Sasol as head of communications. And about 12 years ago, I joined Brunswick in South Africa. Since then, I've been focusing on cyber, crisis, deals, and just general corporate reputation. That's me in a nutshell. Just one thing before I move on to Jonathan, you were mentioning some nice new names. I came across the name Zombies, which I quite enjoyed as well.
Hi everybody. My name is Jonathan Cole. Thank you so much for having us, Ronak. Looking forward to this chat. I'm a digital director at Brunswick, and my responsibilities are I run our global search engine optimization offering, and then I run our digital offering for the South African office and our South African clients.
Great, thanks guys and welcome. We're going to keep this very conversational. Of course, from the audience, from those who are listening in, please feel free to send through your questions, and we'll take as many of them as we can towards the end of the session. But Jonathan, I want to start with you. What's quite interesting about this particular crisis is the amount of information that we're having to contend with. The news cycle is moving very quickly, almost by the second, and it's really complicating life, not only for policymakers, but also for business people. And it's been said that we're dealing with an information pandemic as much as we are a healthcare pandemic. What are your views on that? How are you reading this?
Yeah, I think you're completely right. There is an extraordinary amount of information in play at the moment. We actually did an analysis of the COVID discussion in South Africa about a week ago. And amazingly, we found that there were 50 categories of conversation around COVID. These are ranging from, lockdown life to regulations to the alcohol and cigarette ban to domestic violence, etc. But 50 categories, it was extraordinary. And the reach of that conversation is remarkable. We found quite promisingly that in terms of the top influencers, there were no bad actors actually in play. The prominent voices of the presidency, the Department of Health, and some ministers and some media personalities. And I think this is not to say that there are no bad actors. We've seen a lot of misinformation come through in South Africa around fake cures. There's been some, ideas about ethnic resilience to COVID, dismissals of the efficacy of hand sanitizers and all that. So, typically what we find is that these bits of information will rack up huge views and shares in the short term before they kind of shut down by the social media channels. I think it's also worth pointing out that this misinformation is a much bigger issue than just COVID. And it exists across a wide range of topics, politics, media, etc. And I think even within the public health space, there's been ongoing misinformation, for example, about vaccines. I think interesting point that I think the US had the largest number of measles cases last year since early 90s, just because of the misinformation about vaccines. So this is really happening across not just COVID, but a broad number of areas. And I think, into your question about, the impact on news, I think there's 3 quick points to make there. I think firstly, the widespread challenges faced by media organizations that we're all familiar with, the contraction of the newsroom and the range of news that can be realistically covered, is leaving a lot of informational gaps, that is being filled by news sources of information. And I think that fact-checking verification role that was previously filled by journalists is not there anymore, and for a large number of categories, and I think we're struggling with that. Year on year, also, we're seeing a huge increase, and this is really interesting, of the number of people that are actually getting their news from social media. Brunswick surveys have shown that certain categories like business information, almost the majority of business news is coming through social media and other digital channels.
Isn't that dangerous, Jonathan? And Marina, feel free to come in here as well, because, what's noise, what's news, what's fact, what's fiction, the amount of kind of dangerous up forwards you get where, and particularly because this is an unknown virus, decisions need to be driven by facts rather than this.
Absolutely. I mean, I think as you touch on there, I think the implication of the news coming through social media channels is that we have a huge amount of information that's been curated for us by algorithms, which in turn keep us very firmly locked in echo chambers of our own making. We get shown what the algorithm knows we like. And I think sort of one quick point is also, the final point on that is, we've noticed that in South Africa, this is quite fascinating, that social media in South Africa has the ability to drive traditional media. Now, in most of the other parts of the world, that's flipped. Traditional media tends to drive social media. And I think it's because of, South Africa's social media is very vibrant, it's extensive, it can mobilize very fast. We just have to look at, examples like Bell Pottinger and the White Monopoly Capital narratives. And I think Bell Pottinger was, driven out of South Africa purely off the basis of South African social media. So I think that's the impact on news. I thought we'd have a very quick example of a case study of Stanford Medicine, one of our clients recently. And I'll bring this up because it's a quick example of what it looks like when a company, for example, is faced with fake news. So it's one of our clients that had kind of fought back on misinformation. A lot of quite dangerous information was being spread in their name. And basically what we did with them was started a number of campaigns. We promoted content on their social and digital channels, which we've helped them establish. And we even spoke to Twitter and managed to get them to briefly lift their ban on advertising on COVID, just to help deal with this crisis. So I think to summarize, this example shows us the impact that this news can have on businesses, and the fact that we really need to monitor, assess, and be able to react quickly. We need to be sort of really aware on both a personal and I think an organizational level that misinformation and some very particular filters of our own making can be playing a huge defining role in what we read about our news in our society.
Can I jump in there? Because I think a couple of the questions are relevant actually with regards to fact checking by organizations like Africa Check. Really, really important. These are NGOs that do check the facts. You've got similar ones in the US. And then of course, our media rooms are in disarray. They are struggling to survive. We've already seen a whole bunch of magazines go out of business. They're not the only industry, of course, that's under severe pressure at the moment. But the sustainability of the current print news is very much in jeopardy. There are philanthropists in the US and so on that do support newspapers. They're trying to test paywalls around the world. The Financial Times has been very successful. In South Africa, the verdict is still out on how these really important, credible publications actually are able to sustain themselves. And I think a lot of people on the call might be aware, on the webinar may be aware of the tweet from the exiting Mail and Guardian editor saying that she was in dire straits and readers came to their help. Now, whether that's sustainable in the long term is not clear. But I think that was reference to your question, Ronak, around fake news and the importance of media. I think media is a critical institution for democracy and to filter out the noise and the fakeness.
I want to zoom a bit and just kind of, you know, if you look, I'm a political economist, so looking at some of the big themes that are currently at play, you know, we're seeing a kind of shift away from globalization. You know, there's talk about capitalism needing to kind of change quite dramatically, a shift towards an accelerated digital era, and also a greater era of localization.
Yes.
Where you're sitting and kind of, you know, what are these effects going to be like for business? How should businesses navigate this, and what's top of mind in terms of some of the key themes that you'd be watching if you were a decision maker at a business at the moment?
Yes, of course. So, I mean, this is an existential crisis that none of us have ever seen in our lifetimes. I mean, I don't think since the Second World War, in effect. I mean, all the top business leaders we speak to say this is of a magnitude bigger than the 2008 financial crisis. It's affecting all economies, as we know, and it's affecting supply chains. And I mean, if you watch the news over the last 2 days, the US trade sanctions on the supply chain of Huawei is indicative of the uncertainty and the volatility of what's going on, because I mean, that's obviously geopolitical in as far as trade relations between the US and China, but it does affect businesses around the world. You may find in the longer term shorter supply chains. You may see possibly, I mean, one of our top executives was speaking to us at the Brunswick partner meeting last week, and he was suggesting that you may see the US having supply chains within Latin America as opposed to east-west. But it's very unpredictable. It's very difficult to know so early on. There have been winners out of it, and there seems to be a disconnect between the stock market's rallies and what's happening in the real economy. So as I mentioned, we've had an accelerated day of reckoning for some industries, including print media. I mean, the airlines are also in dire straits, and some restaurants may never reopen, and you may see this move towards cloud kitchens, gym and yoga studios. Some people won't go back. I would imagine they like to do it online through Zoom. We're having to rethink office space and what it means for commercial offices. I think people do like going back to the office, but you know, that's one of the issues. And there have been some winners in this rush to move online. So the tech giants have done well, biotech and pharma, telecom operators, cloud providers, and so on. Those are good trends. I mean, you're not going to turn off your internet. Doesn't necessarily mean it's sustainable, because the regulators are looking at big tech. There's a tech lash. You know, Jonathan was saying, you know, was talking about social media. Well, there was some of the big platforms have been criticized for not taking down fake news fast enough in the past. There's antitrust movements. There's this intersection of tech and health in particular is very interesting. So you're seeing a rapid innovation with regards to telemedicine. In South Africa, for instance, Vodacom and Discovery teamed up to offer a remote doctor consulting service on your smartphones and on your cell phones, which is great. And Discovery always had something like that. It was called Doctor Connect, but the regulations were only allowing for real consultations with doctors. Of course, the technology is really good, and we have a great need for it. So the regulations are being loosened. Now the question is, with all these regulations, is will the regulators roll back after the pandemic is over? And that's one of the trends. I think maybe I'll pause there, Ronak. Perhaps you want to. We can drill down into any of those areas in terms of content.
Yeah, the one thing that I found really interesting, and I want to pick up on, Marina, is you mentioned kind of office spaces in the future. What are they going to look like? And that leads to a broader discussion around the future of work. I mean, what are the skills needed to be successful in this new era? What are our environments going to look like? And just generally speaking, what are the architectural organizational design changes that people should be thinking about?
So there's so much debate about the future of work, and everything you read, I mean, a lot of people are applying their minds to it. McKinsey's done whole reports around it. I was reading today about the big trend to online education and how so many students are looking at tech and AI and some really excellent university courses on the big MOOCs from the top universities is making education now available much more cheaply to anyone, really. But whether these behaviors, I mean, we've seen behaviors change, and I think they will continue to change, but I think there'll be a balance. There'll be a balance between the real world and the online world. With regards to moving back to the office, I do know a lot of the people in my office have got small children and they're just itching to go back to work. Trying to juggle homeschooling with work, with 24-hour calls, it's not sustainable. It leads to mental health issues. It's very exhausting. So I was very amused to see Lucy Kellaway in the FT this weekend. She was always my favorite columnist before she went off to become a teacher. She had all homage to the office, which is the place where you met real people, you had real biscuits, you wore different clothes, you had structure, purpose, you gossiped, you had friends. It gave meaning to life. Many people met their spouses at work. There were after work drinks. So I think there'll be some sort of balance. Opportunities, great opportunities, and maybe more flexibility, which is a good thing. And I was pleased to see Twitter is allowing its employees to work from home forever.
So I mean, I think that's given us, thanks, Jonathan, Marina. I think that's given us a kind of good lay of the land and kind of an understanding of where we're at in terms of how we've been disrupted. But I want to kind of hone in a little bit deeper around some of the big problems that we're seeing. And, one of the key issues in my mind is the level of polarization we're seeing in society. The debate is very much an either or kind of debate at the moment, or when you look at things like lockdown, it's people or the economy, or it's lives versus livelihoods. But the reality is that this is a complex intersectional crisis that requires a multidisciplinary skill set to successfully navigate. And in my mind, one of the big reasons that we're seeing this kind of fraying of the social consensus is, again, the polarization via social media. And I guess my question is to Jonathan around, to be able to successfully navigate a crisis like this, you need to build a social contract, and you need buy-in and public trust. So the issue of trust is fundamental in the social cohesion of society, and I think social media or unregulated social media compromises that to some extent. So, how are we going to be able to get to a point where we are able to respectfully disagree with each other and build consensus? Because I think we've lost that ability.
Look, I think we have to accept a couple of things. There will always be echo chambers and polarization. I think despite significant challenges that these present, I personally love being able to receive curated content based on my interests and hobbies. There will always be elements of human nature in play. There was a study recently, I think it was University of California, that looked at the longer a Facebook conversation went on, the more vitriolic it got, just as a function of that. There will always be algorithms and AI, which, despite amazing and really promising developments that are currently happening, they still cannot distinguish between true and false. And I think it's worth pointing out that we should probably cut the AI and the algorithms a bit of a break, because even as humans, we can have a rough time figuring out fact from fiction. And I think we should also be very clear that the challenge is not a dearth of factual information. The factual information and content in terms of volume significantly outweighs misinformation online. You know, a good example is YouTube, which has become a kind of source of health information. And I think it's the BMJ Journal of Health Study. Currently, they looked at the top COVID YouTube videos with hundreds of millions of views and found that only 27% of that content was not factual information. So I think, look, it's a complicated topic. Where I sit, there are three real challenges, right? And I think the first is a very short term, and it's very critical. There is a significant lack in the sophistication in how public health advocates are responding to misinformation, and how they're positioning and amplifying their factual content. Misinformation agents are way better at engaging neutral audiences and reinforcing fake views in their audiences. These actors are also much better at using sophisticated techniques and technologies that are just not being matched by public health advocates. To really simplify it, factual information online is mostly boring. You know, there's a lack of diverse narratives. It's, you know, in official speak, it's black and white. It's not really engaging. And it does come down to that this content needs to be made more engaging, and it needs to connect with people in a much more meaningful way. So I think in theory,
there. I mean, so, you know, making factual content sexy is one piece. I guess the other piece is kind of, you know, given the dangers of misinformation and disinformation in societies, you would think that it needs to be regulated somehow, but are we asking the right questions, or is the technology evolving too quickly for us?
Yeah, look, I think that's the challenge, you know. I mean, the analogy here is, if there's any new technology, three things tend to happen. You know, the invention of flying, for example, you know, the three things happen. You know, there's a strong education component, you know, pilots are trained, there's a regulation component, and there's an ongoing monitoring and managing. You know, I think for me, the second challenge really is about the regulation of the social media channels. You know, forcing partnerships, managing how social media channels deal with verification, essentially how they're responding to the current crisis. Now, it's important to know that there's no silver bullet here. There's no single issue that's going to be solved. And I think it's also important to recognize that a lot is being done. You know, there's social media channels are setting up dedicated tip lines with accurate information. There are warning labels on content. There's a growth in fact-checking partnerships across all the channels. ARs are being upgraded in really exciting ways. Campaigns are being run. I'm thinking of sort of UNESCO's Think Before You Share campaign. So I think things are being done, absolutely, you know. But I think...
I just want to jump in there a little bit as well, in terms of people joining the conversation. So I think the business leaders need to understand how to join the conversation in a way that is authentic, that they can get their story across, so it's not just factual, because nobody listens to facts, as you say. You need to be told stories. That's the one thing. But then you have the regulators, and I think post this crisis, we're going to see a lot stronger regulatory action. I mean, there's increasing concern about the power of the tech giants and the techlash. So there's going to be skepticism about whether they will do the right thing, because they were reluctant to police disinformation in the past. There are worries about surveillance capitalism, as we know. The idea that Big Brother has now access to all our health data and location at all times. So privacy advocates are very uncomfortable. And already, I mean, you read online that demand from employers. There's a surge with regards to software that's monitoring employees. So all of this is concerning and in the background. And at the end of the day, you're going to have this social contract, as you were saying, because we've got to overcome the crisis together, which is far too big for any one single organization or government to fix alone. So the public acceptance of all these new technologies will ultimately depend on the level of confidence in their governments, in the data protection authorities, in tech companies and employers, and as well as in the performance of systems. So if you're thinking about the contact tracing apps, do they work and are they being used for the right reasons and so on? So I think that's going to be really key. And Europe is leading very much in this data privacy protection debate, because they don't want to see, I mean, you'll recall after the September 11 attacks, personal freedoms did shrink somewhat because of the security at all costs drivers, you know. So COVID-19 could similarly erode privacy in the future. And turning the clock back maybe.
How concerned are you about that? So, I mean, you know,
I think at the moment there's a lot of questions.
Opportunism, big brother.
Yes, I think at the moment a lot of people are looking for, have got a lot of questions, and this is moving so very, very fast. It's obviously a concern, but I do think we're going to see government and regulatory much more involved in the business world going forward. And at Brunswick, we always talk about the 3 connecting circles, and we're going to see more and more of that. So the one circle is regulatory and public affairs. The other is the financial, economic, and the third is social, societal. And I think we're going to see a lot more of those 3 bubbles intersecting with each other. Already we're seeing it in South Africa. If you think of how the Business for South Africa initiative was set up to support government on its COVID-19 initiatives, and the creation of the Solidarity Fund. And this morning I was reading how AMCU was calling for the mines, for instance, to test all their employees. And, you know, I think the mining companies are all trying to move in that direction. They've obviously got to keep their people safe as well, because at the end of the day, that's what they're there to do. It's no longer a case of profits overall.
Sorry, but very quickly, I think there's a very important third aspect to this. You know, we've talked about, you know, public health advocates really needing to up their game and their techniques of getting the right information to the right audiences. We've talked about regulation, but I think there's an important component in the education of the users, you know, and helping people spot fake information. Yeah, there was a fascinating study by the University of Cambridge where they developed a game, a 15-minute game, aimed at teaching people how to spot misinformation. And then within that 15 minutes, they had about 21% increase in efficacy of spotting misinformation, which I thought was incredibly positive. But I would love for us to get to a phase where, you know, the individual can say 3 things to themselves. I understand, firstly, that I am in an echo chamber of my own making. I suspect this information I'm reading may not be correct, and I know how to check it. And finally, I have a responsibility not to spread information without paying attention to the source. So I think that education component is quite a bit. We put a lot of emphasis on regulation, but I would love to see more education.
Thanks. At one point, Jonathan, I just wanted to make the point that also under the COVID-19 Disaster Management Act here in South Africa, you could be fined and have 6 months in prison for spreading false information with the intention to deceive around COVID-19. And already we've seen people who are going to be appearing in court for spreading false information. So quack theories, dangerous cures, fake news, and so on.
Interesting. So, I mean, thanks for that. That was really, really insightful. You know, the one big elephant in the room that I guess, you know, we tend to skirt around is this issue of inclusion. You know, for folks like us on a Zoom call, you know, we've been able to kind of do most of our work from home. We're connected. We've got the technology at our disposal. Eskom is playing ball by keeping the lights on. And, you know, it's been a pretty seamless transition in the services economy where you've kind of got this digital capacity and infrastructure at your disposal. But a lot of people can't work like that. They need to go in and do their job. And I guess the danger is that whilst we've got this wave of acceleration, we're going to leave people behind, and dealing with yawning inequality already to the extent that we have, which is a kind of root cause of a lot of the issues that we're seeing in our societies. Are we likely to see this trend accelerated and inequality get wider, or is there an opportunity to address this? And that's a question to both of you. Maybe Marina, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very big concern. I mean, as you say, most of us in the sort of the services sectors have continued online. But it's often the lower paid people who are, as always, most vulnerable. And we see it when you go out to our homes from here in Johannesburg and you go to the shops to buy food or whatever, or to the pharmacy. You see people on the streets, and it's stark, it's in your face, it's a real concern. The more and more I've been speaking to leaders, to business leaders of big companies, they're all talking about this is a real wake-up call, a proper catalyst for positive change. Now is our opportunity to stand up and show how we're making real and lasting differences. Now, whether it's just rhetoric or whether they're going to see it through, it remains to be seen. But I think Jamie Dimon today in the international media was talking about a wake-up call. Marco Tufani in Business Day yesterday was talking about the need for Anglo to move beyond the mine gate into the communities. Really important to have sustainable communities and that they need to be supported through the crisis. So we're seeing more and more of this rhetoric. I think even at Davos earlier this year, there was a lot of cynicism about the billionaires, talking about how capitalism has worked for them, but everyone was talking about the importance, the move to a capitalist model rather than the shareholder capitalist model. And coronavirus is the acid test. We have to take it forward now from here. The societal issues are enormous. So inequality is the big one that's is very stark in South Africa, but climate change is another one. So the virus has exacerbated that. We're seeing our leaders stand up and talk more about it, whether they're doing it on LinkedIn or they're doing it on YouTube. Some people are talking to their staff through Instagram and LinkedIn. So Jonathan can talk to you about that. We're seeing that some of them take some pain. I wouldn't say it's as much pain as others would like, but they're taking pay cuts, no dividends. Then there's social compacts, as I was saying, the Solidarity Fund and Business for South Africa, for instance, initiatives. So they're talking about social purpose and being part of the solution. Well, now is absolutely the time for business to prove it. And I think some are starting to show it.
We're seeing some interesting trends there where businesses are quickly pivoting and repurposing themselves. So, for example, AB and Bev are using alcohol for sanitizer. Best Western hotels, offered their hotels to medical staff and low-risk patients. Leon have converted their restaurants to supermarkets, and there are countless other examples. Spanish consortiums converting 3D printers into ventilators and the like. And often in times of crisis, innovation is driven by necessity. So to this kind of point around the catalytic effect and innovation being driven by necessity, do you think this will happen organically, driven by the context, or that in an era of big government, the private sector will realize that their role needs to change to being different?
I think all stakeholders are demanding it. So we had the head of a big oil major speak to us last week, one of the top oil companies in the world. And he's transitioning his company into a more sustainable future. So from pure hydrocarbons, he's patted out the journey to cleaner fuels, to renewables and so on. And he says, he was taught his mother taught him to listen. She says to him, you have 2 ears and one mouth. You've got to listen. So he's been out there listening to activists and NGOs. And he says that the points that the mirror they showed us was exactly what our employees have been saying all along. And there's no point being defensive about it. You need to move. You need to move in that direction. So I think the pressure is coming from everywhere, actually. Employees, the other point that he made was that investors were quite circumspect, and they were quite positive. So, and I think this was another CEO that has spoken to us, but he said they didn't retrench people. They were planning to retrench people. It was one of the big banks. He had 235,000 employees around the world. And in 1 week, he had to close down all his offices. So you can imagine the magnitude of the crisis. And it really was a case of, do we retrench these people now? Do we hold back? Do we furlough them? Furloughing, he was suggesting, was a better situation, because once you start reopening the economies, you've got the trust of your employees and you've got the workforce there. But these are all the very, very difficult trade-offs that corporates and governments are having to make.
Critical of that leadership, and we've had such a dearth of quality leadership in recent times that has been, in my mind, fundamentally exposed by this crisis. So we're crying out for a new kind of leadership, and something that's come up quite frequently is this concept of connected leadership. Jonathan, if I can come to you, what does that actually mean, and what are we talking about?
I'll deal with that quickly. I just wanted to make a quick point to follow from Marina. I think Brunswick did a really interesting study, I think about a year or so now ago, but it was looking at trust of institutions around the world. And I was always struck by the South African data, which showed that of all the institutions in play, there's the most confidence that business in South Africa has the power to affect change, more so than the other institutions, more so than government, more so than the military, than religious institutions, all that. And I've always thought that was quite fascinating. The belief that that there is in government and its ability to make change in this country. In terms of connected leadership, and this is related, it's a platform that was developed by Brunswick Group to help us understand how leadership is being redefined in this connected world, essentially. And the app, which you can find on our website, sort of ranks global leaders on how well they are doing this on digital. And why do we bring this up in the context of misinformation? Well, we've spoken about the way unverified information is widely spread online. And what I think we're finding is that brands and organizations are really struggling to cut through the noise. When you hear your brand voice, it's not nearly as powerful as hearing an individual. And we're finding all our data is showing that many audiences want and really need to connect and hear from their leaders at this time. I think before COVID, analysis we did was 80% of employees and 90% of financial readers, for example, expect to hear from a CEO in a time of crisis. So the other thing that's able, a CEO is able to do by using video or presenting to an audience is they're able to communicate empathy. They're able to really demonstrate that they understand problems and really connect with that audience on an emotional level. So this is why we feel that individual leadership rather than brand organizational leadership at certain times can be incredibly effective and valuable.
Great. So guys, I just want to pause there for some questions. We've got quite a few coming in from the audience, and then we'll wrap up after that. But there's a question here coming from Campbell Easton around newsroom shrinking, and we've seen a surge in donor-funded journalism in recent years, and an increase in nonprofits creating content aimed at educating and informing. How successfully have they been able to fill the gap? And I guess secondly, what is the role of civil society and the private sector in this?
I'm happy to jump in there. I think I was trying to touch on that earlier. There's different models. I don't think any of them in South Africa are standout successes. You take the Daily Maverick model, for instance. They don't have a paywall. They have got funders, including foundations, philanthropists, but they also appeal to their readers. So much like the Guardian model in the UK, they appeal to their readers to become insiders and to support them. And that's one model. It seems to be working. Nobody can be advertising driven anymore. The print media are having to move online, and whether they're going to be digital only going forward remains to be seen. You saw the Sunday Times Business Day Financial Mail move across to new owners this year from private equity players, and they're moving very quickly online. They've always had the BD Live website, but very, very difficult models. Broadcast media is very much advertising driven, I think. So I don't really have a definitive answer for you. I mean, you saw the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. I think it's the Washington Post that's owned by Jeff Bezos. So, I mean, I suppose they've got deep pockets in light of Amazon's very, very deep pockets. There's no single model, but it is a critical institution for what the state is really important for democracies. Credible media is critical for democracies. We need to support them.
From our perspective, I think on the point of how well have NGOs and how these small organizations fill that gap, this goes back to my earlier points about there's that factual information, there's that great content out there, but it's not being discoverable because of the lack of sophistication in digital or online tools to make it more discoverable. So what you have is the organizations that do have the audiences partnering with the content producers. We've seen that UNESCO and World Health Organization, that sort of agreement. And I think that the advice here is that NGOs really need to, again, like public health advocates, step up the game in terms of optimization of content, amplification of content, understanding their audiences and when they need their content.
Great, thanks for those insights, guys. There's another question that's come through around tech and health brands that are making an impact. You touched briefly on Discovery and Vodacom, but are there any others that are generating interest and doing some novel stuff?
Gosh, none that I know intimately. I mean, there must be loads. I mean, in terms of the biotech companies, if you think about the intersection of tech and healthcare, I mean, today the markets have rallied off the back of a potential new vaccine by one of the US companies in Massachusetts. I mean, but this is really where the future is going. It's moving extremely fast. But the contact tracing, I mean, there's lots of players playing in that space, big tech players, governments. But as I was saying to you earlier, Ronak, I think there's a lot of concerns about the efficacy of those, or do they work? Do they work well? Because if they don't work well, the spread of the disease will continue. And then there are the concerns about Big Brother and whether you'll be able to roll back those kind of apps later after the COVID outbreak has been contained.
So we're running out of time, but I've got a few more questions that I think are quite important. So I guess, Marina, for you, I'd like to ask, what 3 pieces of advice can you offer to the audience on how best to live and work in this COVID era? And to Jonathan, are you optimistic or pessimistic about a post-COVID world, and why? And maybe let's start with Marina.
So 3 pieces of advice. I think the right mindset. Look for the opportunities. Lift your head and look beyond the horizon. Don't just collapse under the overwhelmingness of this whole thing and just see risk. Have a clear sense of purpose. So that's point number 1. Right mindset. Number 2, focus on what matters most. Family, friends, and what matters most at work. So declutter. Don't focus on things that are urgent but not important. Remember to show compassion for your colleagues. You know, they're going through tough times. They may have lost people. Be transparent. As Mark Kitafani was saying, your communities and your customers and your employees will look back and remember how you communicated and how you acted towards them during this crisis. So that's number 2. Focus on what matters. The 3rd, we all know we can't solve this crisis alone. There's no single person, no single company, no single country that can do it alone. We have to collaborate. It's so overwhelming. We need partners. We're all in this together. So we have to be wise, and we have to work together to try and solve the issue holistically. And eventually this will pass. So it could be our defining moment. We mustn't waste any crisis. We must make the difference, and we can come out stronger on the other side.
Yeah, and I think on your question of whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic about the post-COVID world, I'm hugely optimistic. I think some for all the challenges that we're going through, some great stuff has come out of it. Just shining a light on the realities and the implications of misinformation has been fantastic, and hopefully it outlines the weaknesses in the response by public health advocates in a way that can be really addressed in the future. I think this has also galvanized social media organizations to step up their fact-checking, their partnerships, their AI development, all that sort of thing, which is great. And to Marina's point, I love seeing the partnerships that are happening between governments and organizations and trusted information providers. We can't do this alone. Let's partner with people we trust and work with them. So yeah, very, very optimistic.
Great. Guys, I think we're at the end of time. I just wanted to say thank you very much. That was a brilliant discussion.
Thank you.
Very informative. And I think we are in the midst of a seismic shift in the way we do things on multiple dimensions. So it's really important to stay ahead of the curve, to look at things holistically. And I think lots of food for thought. To our audience, thank you for your questions. Thank you for participating. This crisis, I think, has a long way to run yet, and we'll be back with more forums. So thanks for your time. Thanks for engaging, and join us for the next Gibbs Flash Forum soon. So take care and goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.